This program was produced by and first broadcast on Radio Kidnappers, a community access media station. Thanks to New Zealand On Air for making this type of programming possible.
Hi, Andrew Austin here, and welcome to my show, Austin On Air, right here on Radio Kidnappers, the voice of Hawke's Bay. On the show today we have Simon Nixon, who was recently re-elected as a Hastings District Councillor. Good morning, Simon, and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Andrew, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, congratulations on your re-election, Simon. This will be your fourth term on the council, as far as I remember. And you were first selected in 2010, was it?
That's correct.
And why did you stand for re-election this time, and how many more terms do you see yourself there for?
Well, answering the second question first, this is my last term. I'm determined that be the case.
Okay.
I felt I had unfinished business, that I do make a positive contribution around the council table, perhaps not always to the mayor's delight, but I think to the acceptance of the wider community.
Yeah.
And I felt I needed to keep going just one more term to try and finish off what I had started right at the beginning, remembering that last term was very disruptive with the Lawrence standing down, the by-election and so on. It was really like two half terms.
Yes, absolutely. Now, this you stood in the Hastings Havelock North Ward, and you were the lowest polling councillor who was elected. Was that an issue for you, or was it just a case of getting on the council?
The issue for me is perhaps I spent too much. I seem to be well clear of the next candidate.
Yes.
And, my $400 or $500, I probably could have economised on that and still got in.
Yes, well, there were 12 candidates, and I think there was quite a separation in the quality between them. But you're talking about unfinished business, so what are your priorities for the coming term, would you say, Simon?
Yeah, well, there are a number of issues. I suppose rates, I'm becoming increasingly concerned about the affordability of living in Hastings District Council. We have a lot of older people who are obviously on fixed incomes, dropping interest rates, all that sort of thing. And what this means is they must be facing huge pressure just to find the money to survive. So rates would be way up high. I don't have any immediate solutions other than not spending money unnecessarily on investigations and things like that.
Well, we'll get to that soon. Yeah.
Yes, I thought you might. I have always been a strong supporter of the live streaming process, and we finally are getting that underway. We did our first one the last two meetings.
So that's live streaming council meetings.
Yes.
Yep. That's for transparency, you think?
For transparency.
Yep.
The original approach came from Tom Belford. When I first got on council, I'd only been there a few months, and he did a submission to the LTP. And I thought, I'm right behind that. And I've pushed it ever since. Not successfully. It's taken a long time to finally get some money in the budget, which happened in the current term. And finally we did that.
Why is that so important to you to have it live streamed?
Because I think the council operates in secrecy to a large extent. And more importantly, it's becoming more and more difficult to get media coverage of council activities. Yeah, once upon a time, as I understand, we'd have several newspapers and maybe radio stations there. That's all gone.
Yeah.
In my time, we often had reporters from the two major newspaper links, but that's almost finished.
Yeah.
How else do people find out what's going on? Additionally, I think it will give the media easier access to our meetings, and therefore hopefully the reporting will improve there. So that's the first thing. I guess another issue is the economy is one of my major planks, always has been. I mean, the airport is just a small part. Well, not the airport. The air service is just a small part of that.
Yeah.
We've gone a very long time with not enough land for housing, which I think was a major failure on behalf of council.
Yeah.
I'm actually now starting to worry a little bit about whether we might be starting to plan for too much land, because immigration is dropping, the economy is looking a bit weaker right across the world, and we could suddenly find ourselves with a lot of cost and no chance in the short term of recovering that. I'm also worried about we seem to have become utterly dependent on apples as the basis of our economy. I don't actually think that's a good thing. I mean, I was a grower myself at one stage, so I'm not adverse to the horticultural industry, but I think we should be doing more to try and find some way of diversifying. And once again, our air service is a part of that. Hopefully you'll come back to that particular issue.
Yes, no, definitely, because that is quite topical at the moment, yeah. And interesting, you mentioned land, and also obviously there's always that sort of need between protecting our horticultural and agricultural land and what is good for urban use. So are you saying that we've gone too far, or is it just a case of too much land being made
I think
available?
it's almost a matter of, potentially of too much.
Yeah.
We don't have a problem at the moment. We had the issue of Arataki, which meant a lot of land came off the council agenda.
Yeah.
But we're now looking at Howard Street. We've got Northwood, I think it's called, and Frimley. Just to name 3 areas, plus down Middle Road, down that part there. Yeah. There's a lot potentially there. Now, we should be planning for these things, but we've just got to be careful that we don't get ahead of ourselves, because that becomes a cost to ratepayers. But just picking up on your point, there is a conflict between particularly horticulture and putting land into housing. And probably Frimley I wouldn't have supported had I been on council in those days. But you've got to remember, the orchardists are busy out there building accommodation for RSE workers. Where are they putting it? On their good orchard land. They seem to be somewhat conflicted in their views, in my view, and they actually need to acknowledge that they need workers. Those workers need somewhere to live, even if it's in suburbia or on their orchards. They've just got to be a bit more accommodating, less single-minded about their objections to everybody else trying to make a living.
But creating houses for RSC workers isn't solving our housing problem. It's another aspect of that, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And in fact, you're right. It doesn't solve the overall housing issue, but there are several. The RSE workers are estimated to be using about 500 houses. I'm not sure if that's Hawke's Bay or just Hastings.
Wow.
So that's 500 houses that are not available. Airbnb is thought to be occupying about another 1,500. That's a big chunk out of our housing stock. I don't want to get into sort of slanging the government or anything, but also the various things that government are requiring landlords to implement, insulation, heating, all that, is also pulling a lot of houses off the market.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. And just moving on to just before the election, there was a leak to Hawke's Bay today of information from a public excluded part of a meeting. Before the end of its term, the last council voted in favour of an external inquiry into who leaked it. You voted against that, spending that money. Why did you do so?
Well, for a minute I thought you meant all the water leaks I've gone past at Havelock this morning, but no, you're quite right. There was allegations, I suppose, that somebody had leaked information that was supposed to be contained within council. There's two issues here. The first one is I actually don't think the information should have been kept secret.
Yeah.
So that's number one. I don't think I voted for it. I think I just didn't vote, and that was a mistake. The second issue is that once it got leaked, we suddenly decided we were going to spend a whole lot of money investigating it. Now, for what purpose? We don't even know if the person responsible, if there was a person, is still on council. I don't think they'll ever find out who it is, because if the newspaper doesn't tell us who it was that gave them the information, we'll never find out. That's a waste of money. And so what? I mean, I just don't see... It doesn't seem to have any advantage. To me, it was more about the mayor trying to shift some blame elsewhere.
So now they say that this is going to cost $25,000. In that extraordinary meeting that was held, you suggested a figure, and I don't think it was you had any information they didn't have, but you said of maybe 100,000. And these do tend to sometimes blow out a bit. What's your reasoning for thinking that it might be as high as that?
Well, you recall when I first spoke, I asked the chief executive how much would it cost, and he couldn't tell us. So the figure was open to discussion.
Yes.
I suggested it could. I didn't say it would cost 100,000.
Yeah.
I said it could cost 100,000, and I actually still believe that.
Yeah.
because there are a lot of costs besides what we pay external investigators on these sort of things. And if you look at the staff time that's already been involved, the chief executive, and goodness knows how many more, I would think $100,000 total cost is probably still an underestimate.
That's interesting, because I don't think they ever calculate man hours or person hours in these sort of things. But when you've got a chief executive who's earning quite a bit of money, who's devoting quite a bit of time, that is a cost to the council.
Yes, it is. In fact, I have been pushing for some time that we start to keep better account of staff time, because we get these projects, be it the Tomato Peak track or water, all these other things, and we never know what the true cost of these issues are, and we should, and we could do that if we're more like lawyers or accountants and actually started to keep detailed records of where staff goes. Perhaps not in everything, but certainly on what I call projects.
Yes, and the council is so determined to find out who was potentially the leaker. Surely with the new council, it's time to move forward?
I'm in total agreement with that.
Yeah.
I just say we should just stop, have a clean up. What have they found out so far? The reality is there were so many points at which this information could have leaked out. Apparently, we went down and took the pipe band who occupy a building just behind the council. And for goodness sake, they probably told their wives, and they told their wives and friends, and so it went on. I mean, a major part of that got out that way. There are other ways in which this information could have come out. The idea that somebody went out and deliberately released the report, well, I'm just not convinced it actually happened, to be honest.
Interesting. And the item in question that this has all come from is basically two water reservoirs in Frimley and Eastbourne, one which there was an idea to potentially have something called Water Central, which was some sort of, I know the mayor doesn't like the term water museum, but some sort of look at the history of water and that. And but the deliberations were that no ratepayers' money would be used to fund that. Do you think that was achievable goal, getting someone external funding for this?
Let me ask the first part, which wasn't a question, but you said it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need two water reservoirs. We're told that is a requirement under the new water requirements, and I accepted that and always did. I felt initially while we're looking at different sites, we should just look at the sites without alarming everybody at the possibility they might have a big reservoir next door.
Yeah. 10 metre high.
Oh, yes, pretty big.
Yeah.
As soon as we start to nail down the sites, then I thought we should have gone and talked to people. I was never happy that we didn't do that. What was the second part of the question?
Well, just about not using ratepayer money for the sort of history part of it.
I have seen other projects come before council that are going to be funded either entirely or substantially externally. And it seems so often, next thing, they can't quite get the money. They only get half the money. And they're back at council asking us to dip in further because we've got all this money so far. It'd be pity to let this project go. I just saw this as the same thing. And I was never really totally convinced that Water Central, I'm talking about the whatever you call it, the museum, whatever you want to call it, was a goer anyway. And once again, I'm slightly irritated with myself for not being a bit more outspoken in opposition.
That's one thing I want to pull you up on a little bit there, Simon. You have been on council with a voice, and this has been discussed since May, maybe. Why did you let it go for so long without kicking it to touch?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And really what happens is it's the creeping process that council projects go through. And at which point does it cease to be an idea and become a project? And that's a little hard to decide when you've passed that point. Yeah. But certainly by the time we got the election, it became a big issue. I had already decided I was not a supporter.
Yes.
And so I did decide that.
Yeah.
Perhaps I should have decided a little earlier, but you have to have enough information to really get your head around it. And had we gone to public consultation earlier, would have got a much better idea of what people were thinking. And that can influence how we think ourselves, because we represent the community.
Do you think councillors aren't given enough information by officials in meetings?
Yeah, maybe. Often that is the case. It seems to, we have a very good case at the moment that we increased the chief executive's discretionary spend
yes,
or
I wanted to ask
authorisation.
you about that. From 500,000 to 5 million. That's
to
quite
$5 million.
Quite a leap.
And
yeah.
I have since that raised the issue about that amount because I didn't quite appreciate at the beginning that it was going to mean we actually didn't know what was going on.
No.
He just signed things off. I thought it would still go through a process where it came before council. It doesn't. And so I've become more and more opposed to that figure. We could have doubled it perhaps, would have been a reasonable increase just to get rid of the sort of small stuff. But I'll give you a very good example of why.
Because Napier only has 500,000 for their CEO.
They do.
Yeah.
I'll give you a very good example of why the figure or why the tenders committee, which I'm a member of, is so important. We had a proposal to strengthen the emergency management building. And going through that process, somebody pointed out we could probably build a new building from scratch, right up to earthquake standard, the level we had to have, by knocking, either an additional building, put it that way.
Yeah.
And that might not have happened had we not had a tenders committee for it to go through where people said, why are we spending all this money when somebody says we could build a new building for the same amount? So that's where councillors with their diverse experience and interest and always awareness of spending money can have a big effect. And that has been eliminated. I don't know when we last had a tenders meeting. It's
Well, I was
months.
going to ask you that. I was going to ask when was the last tenders meeting, because I've heard it has been quite a few months.
I would have thought maybe May.
Yeah.
I think we've had one since then. I couldn't quite understand why we had the one we did have. That was just before the elections, but we've gone for many months without a tenders meeting. And this is the process by which councillors actually hold the staff to account and find out what's going on. It's all these little sort of lesser committees, not the major ones because they seem to be rubber stamping exercises, but rather the little events where you actually learn a lot more.
Yeah. And the original idea for Water Central, where did it come from?
Well, I sometimes wonder whether perhaps I wasn't partly responsible for that, in the sense that...
Really?
Yes. In the sense that when I first started to appreciate the size of this structure...
The reservoir.
I started to think... Well, and in fact, the question I did ask at the meeting was, can we make it look like something that isn't a reservoir, even if it is a reservoir? Because if we put a building of similar size on the council land, nobody would say a damn thing. But you look across the road and see this whacking great water tank. You think, my God, what is that? And I thought maybe there was an opportunity. I'm wondering whether that sort of seeded the idea. I may be wrong, but certainly that was my approach, that we wanted to look less intrusive, less of a sort of blot on the landscape.
Yeah.
So maybe I contributed.
Well, interesting confession there, Simon. Thanks for that.
Well, yeah, this is council,
Yeah.
and you have to admit warts and all to your failings as well as claiming your successes.
Yeah. Now, the whole business, I think you'll agree, has caused some tension in council, and the mayoral race got quite bitter at times, and now we have Damon Harvey, who was a candidate, back as a councillor under Sandra Hazelhurst. Do you think there is still a possibility that you'll be able to work together as a functioning team?
I guess I have some concerns, to be truthful.
Yeah.
Not specifically over the Water Central issue, but just generally, because it does seem that the council is becoming very female-orientated. A mayor...
There's nothing wrong with that,
mayor.
surely?
Well, it does exclude. I mean, we've got one of the councillors Facebooking furiously through another channel, talking about, what is it, old, grey, and whatever it is. I can't think of the expression that's...
Pale, male and stale,
That's
I
the
think
one.
you're looking
That's
for.
the one. Yeah, I was looking for that one. But, a lot of people in our community are of that group, and we are representing them.
But that doesn't mean that women don't have as much right and equal opportunity to represent people in council, surely?
Absolutely, they have every right, and it should always be the best person, and if they happen to be women, then they should be chosen for the job. But you might recall, I was elected by fellow councillors to be deputy mayor for a period.
Yes.
And Sandra decided to replace me with Tanya Kerr, for whatever reason. She never explained a reason. She just didn't appoint me when she got the opportunity to change.
Who do you think is going to be deputy this time?
That's the number one question, isn't it? I don't know at this stage. There's been no conversations between councillors in a formal or semi-formal environment.
I suggested that maybe as the olive branch you should make Damon Harvey deputy.
That is an option for sure, and I guess that could happen, or it might be. I just don't see it happening with Sandra, to be honest.
Now, just going, because we are starting to run out of time, can you believe it? But a couple of things. Havelock North water crisis, water contamination, whatever you want to call it. You were personally affected by that.
Yes.
Because you got quite ill.
I did.
Will that ever happen again? What are you doing to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Well, the election sort of attracted a lot of comment and promise about fixing the water.
Yeah.
But after all, the council has put in place a $50 million program to fix the water. And I think we need to and those are what the storage tanks are for, part of it.
Yeah.
I think we should let that process continue, because with the multi-barrier approach to providing safer water, I think really it is in hand. I mean, I'm upset about some of the costs, which seem to be hugely high, but it will fix the problem. UV, chlorine, people hate chlorine, but it does.
What's your view on chlorine?
I think it's unavoidable at the moment if we can get rid of it, but we admit to having about 22% leakage out of our system, and if water's getting out, something can get back in. So the distribution system is not secure.
Yeah. Now, moving on, many people associate you with the fight to get a second carrier into the airport, into Hawke's Bay Airport, and feel that you were quite responsible, played a role in getting Jetstar to come in there. They're now leaving. Are you going to take up the fight again?
Indeed I am. Yeah. I don't claim that I was the reason Jetstar came, but it was certainly something I have pushed for way before I got on council. This is about 15, 16 years now. I think Hawke's Bay will suffer terribly if we can't do something to keep our airfares down. Jetstar came, airfares halved. There's another 250,000 people going through the airport, a 50% increase in just 4 years. That would not happen if Air New Zealand had retained their total monopoly. And I really worry that we're going back to the bad old days, and slowly our tourism, our business, our conferences, the whole thing will start to shrink again. And it does raise a big question about the airport board, who I would like to replace. I'll say that now on your program.
Yeah.
Because I think they have failed us miserably for a very long time. They're ill-equipped to handle such an important role.
So you put in the blame at their door?
Part of it. They never came. I mean, Jetstar said they were losing 20 million, 4 cities, 4 years. That's about a bit over $1 million per city per year. Nobody came and said they were. Maybe you could, dip your hand in your pocket. We pour enough money into tourism and all sorts of other things. The airport kept saying we're looking after it. Well, clearly they weren't looking after it.
What does this mean for the expansion of the airport now that we're going to lose one of the carriers?
Well, I can't help but wondering. Firstly, the expansion has been delayed by the failure of the lead contractor. It seems to be progressing at a snail's pace, and if we suddenly find we've got 100,000 people less going through the airport, less car parking, etc., the airport, well, we could suddenly find the airport banging on our door saying, we've run out of money, could you give us some money, to government and the council shareholders.
Now, Simon, just one last question. So there's been the tomato track, there's been water contamination, there's been the water central. These are, to various people, are potential failures by council, or they probably didn't handle it the correct way. How can you as a councillor promise the ratepayers that you will be more vigilant when it comes to these sort of things?
I think there's a culture problem at the council. Part of the secrecy, part of the and I'll use the tomato peak. I mean, somehow Councillor approved it. Sandra didn't know, and neither did any of us. But how come some staff member says, this is all right? Did they not go around the back of the peak and take a look and say, ooh, it'd be quite serious, wouldn't it? I mean, that's culture. That's what we're missing, and that's what we need to fix. And I definitely hope to do something about that. Or, I mean, you can't do it on your own, but that'll be one of the issues I'm pushing.
Well, we'll be watching and seeing what you do, and hopefully you get it right. Simon Nixon, thank you for your time today, and good luck for the future.
Thank you, Andrew. Been a pleasure.
And to the listeners, thank you, and we'll see you next time.
This program was produced by and first broadcast on Radio Kidnappers, a community access media station. Thanks to New Zealand On Air for making this type of programming possible.